1 week season.
What is going on? OWS fam, DFS fam, YouTube fam, welcome to the Week 10 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host, I am your guest, I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed, and let's get started with what might be, what might be the final Angles podcast. We'll see. The more we talk about it, the more we realize we're probably scrapping this podcast for next year because not as many of you listen to this because, as we talked about, as much as we try to avoid just being redundant in this podcast, we do end up hitting on a lot of the same things that I've hit on in the Block Party with Pete Overzet, in Solo Ship with Squirrel Patrol. Block Party you can find on Pete Overzet's YouTube channel. Solo Ship you can find on the 1 week season YouTube channel or on the 4for4 YouTube channel. And then, of course, if you follow my journal throughout the week, if you read my player grid, you're going to get the same stuff sort of over and over again. So we always use this podcast to try to talk high level, to try to talk about the idea that DFS is a game of strategy. DFS is not a game of picking players. DFS is a game of building rosters, and every week is unique. Every week is different from the weeks before, the weeks after. And so in our minds, we want to isolate that individual week and think about what the picture on the puzzle box looks like for that particular week. And this podcast, in theory, is a good opportunity for us to isolate our thoughts down that track. But again, we do ultimately end up touching on the same things that we've touched on in other areas. So we're moving closer and closer to saying, yeah, there's probably no need to do the Angles podcast next year. But then that makes me wonder, do I need to be doing it weeks 11 through 18, holidays coming up, travel, things get tighter and busier, and want to make sure that I'm focusing on my player grid and on my journal to provide the best content that I can provide. But we will see if we see you back here next week or not. But for now, we're here. Let's move forward with this week's Angles podcast, a very interesting week. And so I'm going to walk through some things that if you've been reading my journal throughout the week, again, you've kind of followed this thought process. But just to put a bow on it and really pull it all together, I want to talk about how I started this week. So I started this week looking at high-priced running backs. Oftentimes when we are getting a feel for a slate, building practice rosters, whatever it is, we do look at the running back position first and foremost. And so let's go through some of these high-priced running backs. And we're just going to talk through, obviously, these guys have ceiling, but we're just going to talk through some of the downside opportunities on these running backs. So with Christian McCaffrey against the Rams, Christian McCaffrey so central to this 49ers offense, nearly 50% of the team's offensive touches on the season. And yeah, the matchup's not great against this Rams defense, but Christian McCaffrey did have his third best game of the year in this matchup earlier this year. In fact, if we take out games where Kittle's been on the field, which helps a lot with the run blocking, if we take out those games, Christian McCaffrey had his best game, his best non-Kittle game of the year in this matchup earlier this year. The 49ers scored 26 points against all odds against this great Rams defense. I say against all odds because that was one of the first Mac Jones weeks, and that was no wide receivers, Kendrick Bourne stepping in, and yet the 49ers came in and did that. 49ers who, with Shanahan and McVay, obviously used to coach together, been friends for a long time, been connected for a long time in this division going against each other. Shanahan has typically had the upper hand in this matchup. And so there's certainly pathways to a solid game from CMC. In fact, it would be surprising if CMC puts up a DraftKings score in the teens this week. He should get up over 20, 22, 23, 25, 27, but I'm kind of seeing that 27-pointer as his likeliest ceiling. Can he get past that? Absolutely. Things can break his way. He can hit a long run, or he can have a multi-touchdown game where they get stopped on the 1 yard, then a couple times those touchdowns end up going to him. However it shakes out, he can certainly have a bigger game than that. But when we're looking at where our confidence is, what we're sort of leaning into him for, we're really leaning into him for the 25, 26, 27-point game, and then saying, yeah, maybe we get lucky and have something more than that. Well, that's really good. In terms of raw points, that's good. Anytime we can get a 25 to 30-pointer, that's good. But again, 9K is a lot to spend where that's our expectation. So there's CMC at the top. And then things really start to crumble a bit more from there. So next we have Jahmyr Gibbs. Only 2 games all season over 20 DraftKings points. Only 1 game all season over 26.9 DraftKings points at 8K in salary. Well, 26.9 is barely more than 3x what you're paying. And he's gotten over that only once all season. And so totally different tier than CMC, where again, CMC would take away the game against Houston. He has 22 or more DraftKings points in every single game. We save a mere 1,000 in salary, and we have a guy who has gone over 20 points only twice all season long. So CMC obviously in a different tier than Jahmyr Gibbs. But in terms of ceiling, and ceiling is what really matters. We're trying to win tournaments. Now, again, floor consistently matters. We talk about that a lot and why that matters, especially on tighter builds. But ceiling is ultimately what wins this tournament. So if Gibbs has one of his 33, 35-point games, it doesn't really matter to us that within his range of outcomes was a 16-pointer or a 17, 18-pointer. What matters to us is we got that ceiling game and that he outproduced these other guys priced around him. So Gibbs should be kept in consideration because of the ceiling. But again, what we're likeliest to get here, just based on what we've seen all season long, is we're likeliest to get another game of 16, 18, 20, 21 points, something like that. Maybe we get fortunate and we end up with one of these 25, 26-point games, or really fortunate we end up with one of these 30, 32, 35-point games that we know Gibbs is capable of. But again, pretty massive room to the downside here and not a lot of confidence toward the upside. Then we have James Cook, 7,500. Across his last 4 games, he has 2 targets and 1 catch. In this stretch of games, he has 1 game over, this is all season. He has 2 games over 25.5 DraftKings points, 1 game over 29.5 DraftKings points. Again, he can get there. He can certainly get there in this matchup. We're not really too worried about matchup with James Cook anyway. He did it against the Panthers run defense that's been really good. He had a solid game against the Chiefs run defense that's really good. The Dolphins, attackable run defense early in the year. These last 3 games have actually done really good selling out to stop the run. They've Quinshon Judkins, we got the big game from him, but that was at 3 touchdowns, and he was pretty much stonewalled in that game. I saw people after the game kind of making excuses and being like, well, as the game moved along and the Dolphins knew he was going to be running the ball, but it was like, that really wasn't how that game played out. We got bailed out by the 3 touchdowns in that spot. They completely stamped out the run against the Falcons with Bijan Robinson and then slowed down Derrick Henry. So they've rededicated themselves to stopping the run, to how they are approaching stopping the run. They've been doing a really good job of that lately. Again, that doesn't really matter with James Cook, but we see, right? And again, James Cook, he entered the league. The story around him was he's just a pass catching back. He's not a guy that we can rely on for, between the tackles running or a consistent rushing threat. And he has developed his game to a point where he's now one of the best all around running backs in the NFL. Point being, he's a tremendous pass catching back. It's not like this stretch of 4 games with 2 targets, 1 catch is because he's incapable of putting up a big game through the air. But at this point, we have to start thinking, why are the Bills doing this? Well, the likeliest theory is that the Bills are putting stuff on tape so that later on in the season, in a big game, say playing the Patriots, if they have the same record as the Patriots in week 15, I think they play, and fighting for that division win, or a big game against, a couple other big games that the Bills still have down the stretch against really good teams, or maybe the playoffs, right? That the Bills are putting this on tape now for teams to not be looking for James Cook in the pass game, to not be preparing for that. And then all of a sudden the Bills come out with a game plan where Cook is being targeted 6, 7, 8 times, right? So that's kind of what I think we're seeing from the Bills right now. And if that's the case, well, a game against Miami is probably not the game where they break that tendency and say, hey, we've been putting stuff on film here to try to throw the Dolphins off, and now we're going to bust out the James Cook passing plays. So we have to kind of assume that we're going to see another game where most of his work is on the ground, which again gives him a lot of paths to the downside and fewer paths to the upside with PPR scoring, where we're looking for this 25, 28, 30-plus point game. And again, it's only 1,500 more. Can we clear out 1,500 in salary to get up to CMC where we're really confident we're going to get that 22, 25, 27-point game with ceiling above that. Whereas Cook, we're like, hopefully he gets there to 22, 25 points. Achane, kind of same thing, right? Achane is popping in optimizers. He's popping in projections because he's so consistent and because the ceiling is there. But across his last 18 games, he's gone over, I think it's 21 DraftKings points. He's gone over 21 DraftKings points only 3 times in his last 18 games. So yes, the ceiling is there, but his chances of getting to that ceiling are not particularly high. And as I've been going through rosters this week, every time where I'm like, man, running back's kind of thin. Well, we know that Achane's going to get the work and the matchup against Buffalo is good. Let me just put Achane on this roster. And you realize that optimizers and projection systems are kind of doing the same thing. Hand builders are kind of doing the same thing. So we're going to see this inflated ownership on Achane where realistically, his chances, like his likeliest output is going to be 16 to 20, 21, 22 points at 7,400. That's not helping people much, and it's helping us if we end up without that score on our rosters. So these are all the running backs over 7K, and looking through them early in the week, I was thinking, man, like we've got JSN on this slate. We've got Puka on this slate. We have Amon-Ra St. Brown. on this slate, is there viability to just saving salary at running back twice and focusing on high-priced wide receivers, maybe getting two of these high-priced wide receivers? Well, that's where the other issues come in, is like Dowdle looks really good, obviously, but then who else looks good, right? We've got maybe like Quinshon Judkins at 6.5K, Derrick Henry at 6.8K, but now we're pretty close to the Achane and James Cook price point anyway. And so it's kind of like, well, you're really just comparing, you're not saving salary. You're just comparing this guy to those guys. I think DeAndre Swift looks good. I'll get deeper into that in the player grid this week. But it's like, well, what about Kenneth Walker, who is going to see 13 to 17 touches and does have ceiling? What about Travion Henderson, who is in a bad matchup on the ground, but is going to be involved through the air, played 75% of snaps last week, should see 15 to 18 touches again in this spot? What about Aaron Jones, who had a much bigger role last week than we had been seeing him have early in the season before he started dealing with injuries? Well, that's kind of the issue with Aaron Jones, is he's an older back. They want to limit his workload and keep him healthy deeper into the season. I mean, the Packers were doing that for years, and now the Vikings are doing that with him. But what if he comes out at 5,200, I believe, and sees a bigger role this week? And we know he's explosive. We know he can put up big games. And then you got David Montgomery at 5K, where it's like, okay, yeah, he's probably putting up 8 points, 10 points, 12 points, but he's capable of 20. He's capable of 25. He's capable of 30 at only 5K in salary. And so I was playing around with this idea of, what if we play Dowdle with one of these cheap guys? And yeah, we're saving salary on a guy that we're not super confident in. But you look through the 5K to 6K wide receivers, we don't have a lot of confidence in that price range either. And so it's like, well, what if we just shift that low confidence and hope for ceiling away from the 5K to 6K wideouts, 6K running backs, save salary in the field, and then we're able to pay up for two of these high confidence wide receivers. So I was building some early practice builds where I was messing around with this, trying to see how this might work. And then last night, Thursday night, I got to like really digging into my thoughts on wide receivers. And it was like, well, aren't these high-priced wide receivers kind of the same as these high-priced running backs this week? Puka Nacua, well, I should say maybe not the high-priced running backs, but the CMC, right? Where Puka Nacua, we know the targets are going to be there. We know it's going to be a competitive game, which we like because that gets this forward-leaning posture from the offense where every drive you're trying to maximize points. So you're not tripping over that strategy angle of like, okay, well, we've got this 10-point lead and they can't do anything against our defense. So yeah, we want to score in this drive, but we also don't want to give them a short field and get them back into this game. We don't want to make mistakes. And so we're calling the game differently. We're not going to have that here. We're going to have both offenses remaining aggressive throughout the game. We know that Puka is going to get tons of scheme touches, tons of opportunities to just get the ball in his hands in the open field and see what he can do with that. But also, he's not going to be running free against this San Francisco defense. I know they're missing a ton of pieces. They're not getting pressure on the quarterback, but it's still a well-coached, well-schemed defense where they're going to make it difficult. When he catches the ball, they're going to be rallying to the ball. There's going to be lots of guys there. They're going to be punching at the ball. There's going to be 3 or 4 guys trying to take him down. So the chances of him having this monster 170-yard, I think his big game earlier this year was against Washington. I could be wrong on that, but it was against one of these defenses where it's like just a bad secondary and you can kind of project him running free and putting up tons of yards. Well, that's not as likely in this spot. So I kind of laid out the case in my journal this week, this idea of, this is the type of game where we could have 8 catches for 90 yards, and then the Rams get the ball back at the end of the game, needing a drive to win the game, whether they're down 3, down 4, tied game, whatever it is. And on that drive, Puka goes from 8 for 90 up to 9 for 110 or 10 for 115. And maybe he scores a touchdown on that drive and we get up to this 28, 29, 30-point DraftKings score. Or he doesn't get there, right? He ends up just down at like 17 or 22 or 23, something like that. And so that's sort of the game I'm expecting from Puka here, is where it's like, yeah, the low end, he's still getting up close to 20 or into the low 20s. The high end, he's getting up into the high 20s. But it's hard to see the pathway, especially as a guy who doesn't have a huge red zone role. It's hard to see the pathway for him putting up one of these 33, 35, 37-point games. Then we look over at JSN. Well, JSN, same thing, right? Now, the Cardinals are missing Max Melton this week. They're missing Will Johnson. They're 2 starting corners, right? That's a big deal for this defense. Will Johnson's a really good rookie cornerback. Max Melton's been playing really well this year. So that certainly helps on the JSN side of things. But do we expect him to be just running free in this one? His only down game all season was against Arizona. I loved this stat from Lord Reeves earlier this week that the only team that has led the opponent for more minutes this year than the Cardinals is the Seahawks. So the Cardinals have the second most minutes in the NFL leading their games. and yet they have this 3-5 record. And I think the people are looking at that 3-5 record, is it 3-5, 3-6, whatever it is, are looking at that record and they're getting fooled by what this team is, right? They've lost by 1, 3, or 4 points to Seattle, San Francisco, Indianapolis, and Green Bay. And in all of those games, they were in position to win in the fourth quarter and couldn't get it done. So that loss to Tennessee, where there was the weird sequence of events, Amari DiMarcano throwing the ball at really past the goal line, but throwing the ball at the goal line, and then that sequence down near the end zone where the Titans throw an interception and the Cardinals fumble the ball and the Titans recovered in the end zone. Like all the weird things had to happen for the Titans to come back and win that game. That sort of shifted perspective on the Cardinals away from if they had 4 wins and whatever they'd be, 4-4, 4-5, with these really close wins to Indy, San Francisco, Seattle, Green Bay. That would be a different perception around this team than what we have now with their record and a loss to Tennessee. But this is a very, very good, very competitive team. And they're going to have a plan in place, whether it's successful or not, we don't know. But they're going to have a plan in place to say, JSN is not beating us in this one. He's not going to be running free in this one. And so we can look at a game like JSN smashed against Houston, against Derek Stingley, right? But Houston is able to say, we think Derek Stingley can hang with JSN. We don't need to give him a lot of help. Whereas Arizona, it kind of shifts to where it's like, no, we do need to give help. So we saw the Jets, not the Jets, we saw the Bears last week do it to Jamar Chase, where it was like, we're going to double team Jamar Chase. We're going to force T. Higgins to beat us. Well, T. Higgins didn't beat them, but T. Higgins did put up the big game, right? Well, we could see Arizona do that this week and say, yeah, we can't cover JSN, but we're going to sell out to bracket him. We're going to put 2 guys on him at all times. We're going to make sure that he's not having this monster game and force Seattle to win in a different way. And so JSN almost certainly gets up over 20 points again, has clear pathways to 25, 26, 27 points, even 30 points, but it's going to be harder for him to put up a tournament winner. The type of score that if you didn't have this player, you say, man, I couldn't win this weekend because I didn't have this guy. And then we've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who probably will be running free against this Washington secondary, but also we expect with Marcus Mariota under center, with Angry Lions coming to town, double Angry Lions, coming off that tough physical loss to Minnesota last week, and then coming into this game against a team that beat them in the playoffs last year, upset them in the playoffs last year. And so we expect the Lions to be aggressive. We expect them to be doing well in this spot, but we might expect them to do too well in this spot where they're controlling this game and dominating in the spot. So then the question mark comes in of like, yeah, Amon-Ra St. Brown is probably getting up to 20 DraftKings points. Does he get up to 25? Does he get up to 27? Does he get up to 30 plus in a spot where the Lions should control this game? And so that's where these question marks trickle down of like, how do we play these guys? How confident are we that any of these guys are putting up the game that you had to have this week? And so we kind of go deeper down the player pool and we realize this is actually a pretty thin week at 5K to 6K wideouts, 5K to 6K running backs. There's not even a ton of confidence in our range of outcomes, our floor to ceiling outcomes in the 6K to 7K range. Now, why that matters for overall scoring is, yeah, one of these guys in the 6K to 7K range could put up the 31-point game, but also that player could be paired on a roster with one of these other 6K to 7K players who is putting up the 11-point game, the 14-point game. And so like across the board, what roster construction as a whole is going to look like, we could have just a lot of these rosters being pulled down, not super high scoring. And so because of that, just getting the points on Puka, JSN, Amon-Ra St. Brown, CMC can have a lot of value on this week, but none of these guys are likely to post a score that, let's say you have a stack, right? And you can't fit in one of these guys. Well, it's unlikely that these guys are putting up a score. Now, it can happen, but it's unlikely these guys are putting up a score where you're like, man, I could not win without that one score, right? And so that's how we want to be looking at these guys is like, yeah, if I'm building a single, a quarterback plus 1 pass catcher or a double stack, quarterback 2 pass catchers, but no bring back, and I have a lot of salary flexibility, next thing I'm doing typically is going to one of these 4 players that we're highlighting, CMC and these 3 wide receivers. If I am building a triple stack or if my salary is going a different direction where I can't fit one of these high price guys, generally speaking, I'm looking at these guys and saying, yeah, I think that's okay this week. And so that was sort of my flow through the week was I started this week saying, we like the high-priced running backs. We like CMC, we like Dowdle, but we don't like a lot of these other running backs. CMC doesn't have the had-to-have-it ceiling this week, and so maybe I'll save salary at running back and go to multiple of these high-priced wideouts. And you realize these high-priced wideouts are kind of in the same category as well. So I don't necessarily want to take on tighter builds a Kenneth Walker or an Aaron Jones or a Travion Henderson just to fit in multiples of these high-priced wideouts, or just to squeeze in one of these high-priced wideouts where they're kind of the same as the CMC type play. And so, yeah, that's been sort of the shape to my week this week. I also want to highlight a couple other of these high-priced wideouts. We went to all the running backs over 7K, so the other wideouts over 7K. Justin Jefferson, my notes here just say JJ, right? Justin Jefferson is dealing with JJ McCarthy, where he actually looks really good against the Lions, did some really impressive things in that game, made some great tight window throws, aggressive throws in that game, but the Vikings continued to limit his passing volume. We saw them do this with Sam Darnold last year through the first third plus of the season. I think it was the first 7 games where Darnold wasn't being asked to throw the ball. In most games, it was like under 30 pass attempts. And then as they moved deeper into the season, they started unleashing him more and more, putting more on his plate. Clearly, the Vikings are doing that with JJ McCarthy and trying to ease him into this full control of the offense type of role. So it can happen in this game if Baltimore jumps out to a big lead, but more than likely, we're not seeing the Vikings with heavy passing volume in the spot, which hurts Justin Jefferson at his price tag. And then Devontae Adams above 7K, the biggest end zone role in the entire NFL, 8 touchdowns on the season, and still hasn't gone over 3.44x his salary. And so it's going to take a lot for him to put up one of these 4x and above types of scores where he's had the good run out, right? He has the big end zone role. He's been scoring the touchdowns and still hasn't been getting there at this price tag. And so, again, I think we have a very interesting shape to this slate where CMC, you're overpaying for him. Puka and JSN and Amon-Ra St. Brown, you're overpaying for them for their ceiling, for their expected ceiling, not their possible ceiling, but their expected ceiling. But then you kind of get below that. It's like, well, there's a lot of question marks on the running backs priced below CMC. There are question marks on these wide receivers priced below these top 3 guys. And so are we just leaning into some high confidence points here and then building around that? And then again, recognizing that we don't have to do that if we have a roster where those guys don't fit, but those still become guys to lean into, and maybe less confidence than I had earlier in the week of the idea of like, hey, let's just sell out and take some cheap running backs and say, yeah, hopefully we get 12 to 20 points, which is what we're kind of hoping for at the 5 to 6K wideouts anyway. Hopefully get 12 to 20 points from this cheap running back and then swing over to higher confidence at wide receiver. I don't know that we necessarily have the higher confidence at wide receiver. On top of that, game environments. We don't really have anywhere where we look at it and we say, yeah, this is probably going to take off, right? And if it takes off, we know how to take advantage of that. So Giants at Bears is definitely a game environment that's attractive. Last night in the journal, I ranked the game environments by tier, and this was in the 4th tier out of 5. So like almost to the top tier is how we'll say that. So I started, first tier was the lowest confidence games, the Jets and Browns, the Jags and Texans, of like, we're probably not seeing any wacky levels of scoring in these games. Giants Bears was in that 4th tier. So up there near the top. But again, the Bears, right? They put up more than 26 points against the Bengals and against the Cowboys. Now, the Giants themselves have allowed, I think it's 32 plus points in 3 straight games, but they've also held down Indy, they've held down the Packers, they've held down the Eagles, they've held down several really good offense to fewer than 20 points. So they're capable of those types of games as well. And a lot of times the Bears are just shooting themselves in the foot as well, right? So when you don't just have a wide open field like you do against the Bengals or against the Cowboys, or kind of playing 7-on-7 style football out there, they are making mistakes that are hurting themselves. And then on top of that, like, even if they have the big game, who are you stacking Caleb Williams with, right? I talked about this in the block party today, but like, Caleb Williams, I had like 5 or 6 quarterbacks in my pool last week. Finally ended up cutting out Caleb Williams. Didn't have it, right? And so on the one hand, you're like, man, I missed out on the 38-point game from Caleb Williams. But on the other hand, you're almost always going to stack the quarterback because that's the mathematically sound thing to do. And then if you stacked him with Rome Odunze, which is the clearest way to stack him, then you're like, yeah, I missed out on the 38-pointer from Caleb Williams. I also missed out on the 38-pointer from Caleb Williams plus Rome Odunze, which costs a lot more in salary, costs $12K in salary for a 38-pointer as opposed to $6K in salary for a 38-pointer. And so, yeah, we have to think about that as well, is even when Caleb hits, last week it was with Loveland, but that took Cole Kmet getting a concussion. Loveland had 0 targets before that happened. Loveland also had, the 58-yarder or whatever it was, the touchdown that ends the game in overtime. And so, like, a lot had to go right for Loveland to have that big game. And you certainly couldn't have played Loveland there and been like, oh yeah, I pushed all the right buttons. I knew that this was coming, right? Like a lot had to break his way for him to have that big game. Fine, if you did that and got lucky, that's awesome. But like, you didn't do that from skill, saying like, no, I really think that this is a spot where Loveland's going to get involved, and here's the reasons why, because that wasn't why things played out that way. And so stacking Caleb becomes difficult. Stacking Dart becomes difficult because so much of this through Dart is just him taking over and doing things himself on the ground, scoring rushing touchdowns and all that. And so do you play him with Wan'Dale Robinson and just cross your fingers and hope you get one big play downfield, right? Wan'Dale Robinson, who had whatever it was, 9 catches for like 50 yards last week. And that's what we're getting with Wan'Dale Robinson. And we know it's going to be a mostly short area. You're hoping you get that one big play, or that they expand his role, which is less likely with Darius Slayton out there. Do you play him with Darius Slayton? Well, Darius Slayton still hasn't had any of these games this year where it's like, yeah, well, good thing we played Darius Slayton, or wish I would have played Darius Slayton. Do you play him with Theo Johnson? Well, if Theo Johnson doesn't get the receiving touchdown, his scores look dramatically different. And so it's a very interesting game environment, but very difficult to figure out how to stack in the best mathematical sense, right? So where people could be chasing this game environment, the game environment could take off, and we could still see very few rosters that are really benefiting from that game environment taking off. So just again, giving a layout of what this slate looks like. Bills at Dolphins. We've got Josh Allen has just absolutely dominated Miami throughout his career, but he's been very different against Miami at home versus on the road, because you're playing in Miami, you're playing in the heat. Last forecast I saw was 84 degrees, 74% humidity. Man, you're practicing in Buffalo at this time of year. You're going down there. That's very different for your body to get used to. You're on that visiting sideline in your dark jerseys with the sun beating down on that sideline, because, you know, the Dolphins got their home field advantage with the shadows on their sideline. And so we can expect a strong game from Josh Allen here, but do we see the tournament winner? Well, that seems pretty unlikely in this spot where the Bills are not super likely to be pushed, and where we know that Josh Allen, you know, is typically putting up his big games against Miami at home as opposed to on the road. Then we got Ravens and Vikings, right? We have the Vikings last week. They looked like a playoff team that was pouring more into one week than their opponent was pouring into that week. That was honestly what it looked like. And that's often the issue for Baltimore, is that they've got this tremendous team, but when another team really brings it, I think I've seen Chris Sims describe it as like the Baltimore Ravens are used to being the bully. And when they go out and try to bully another team and that team pushes back, they're like, wait, that's not supposed to be what's happening here, right? We're the bully here. Well, that was how the Vikings played last week. And so certainly the Vikings to come out swinging and have a really good game in this one. That increases the ceiling, because, you know, if Lamar Jackson and Todd Monken are able to figure out this Brian Flores defense, put up points, all of a sudden the Ravens are scoring, and then the Vikings are forced to respond, and they've got this mentality, this playoff mentality. They're going out there trying to save their season, same as the Ravens are going out there and trying to save their season. But it also lowers the floor, because, or it puts the floor in question, I should say, because, things could also play out differently, to where the Vikings have a game plan that's slowing down the Ravens. The Vikings are able to play offense the way they want to, which is leaning on the ground game, shortening the game in this one. And so another game where sort of a broad range of outcomes and not super high confidence. Patriots at Buccaneers is one where everybody sort of wants it to have tournament winning upside, but outside of Miami in week 2, without Christian Gonzalez for the Patriots, in Miami, where they still had Tyreek Hill, that's the only time the Patriots have given up more than 23 points in a game this season. And we know the Buccaneers can do it. They've done it against Seattle this year as a tremendous defense, but also most often this year with the Bucs, with their depleted cast of weapons, are not doing it. They're not putting up the big games. The Buccaneers also have a good defense, and the Patriots are one of the lowest passing volume teams in the NFL. Like, pass rate over expectation is there because they're dropping back, but then Drake May's running the ball. We're not getting the big passing volume. He's dropping back. He's taking the sacks. He's running the ball, and so we're not getting the big passing volume in this spot most of the time for the Patriots. So yeah, we want this to be a shootout, but what's probably going to happen in this game is both teams are scoring in the mid-20s, maybe one team in the low 20s, one team in the mid-20s, and it's that type of game. And so yeah, the shootout is possible, but it's not high probability. Cardinals and Seahawks, you know, we've seen the Cardinals surprise all season. We kind of talked about this in the JSN section, but all season long, we've seen the Cardinals surprise and lower scoring in their games, which is how they have to win, right? They're not going to go out there against Seattle, a team that I think only the Bucs have put up more than 20 against Seattle this year. They're not going to go out there with Jacoby Brissett against Seattle, in Seattle, and expect to put up 27 points, right? They can do it. It's unlikely, and they're going to know that. So their game plan is going to revolve around slowing down this game, limiting the big plays that Seattle can do, forcing Seattle to march the field, forcing Seattle to win through the run game, where, yeah, they're happy to lean on the run, but those runs are not actually picking up explosives, right? And so that's how we should see that game playing out. And so we're kind of painting the picture going through this slate of like a lot of spots where we don't have high confidence in the game environment taking off, and then a lot of individual high-priced pieces where we don't have high confidence in those individual pieces taking off. And then as we've alluded to, a lot of these mid-range players in pricing are not super high confidence toward the upside this week as well. Another game, 49ers are only implied for 22.5 against the Rams. They did score 26 last time, right? But we've also highlighted outside of last week where they put up, 34 against the Giants. They hadn't topped 26 points all season. They did score 26 against the Rams earlier this year. And that was, if I remember correctly, it was a Thursday night game, right? So that's a little bit easier because you have less time to prepare. Two teams that know each other well, you kind of fall back on your standard static game plan in that type of spot. And then the Rams had Kendrick Bourne going off in that, or the 49ers had Kendrick Bourne going off in that game. And so, it was sort of a weird game, right? But that's not what we typically see against the Rams. And what we're likely to see is very similar to the game we talked about above with the Pats and Bucks, is a very competitive game where both teams are scoring in the 20s, but unlikely for this to take off into one of those shootout type game environments. So because this whole slate kind of looks like this, I think we're going to see a lot of people talking about these two games as potential shootouts and attractive game environments. But that's because we need potential shootouts to talk about. We need attractive game environments to talk about. If we actually zoom out and say, are these attractive game environments? Are they likely to shoot out? No, they're not, right? They are likelier than some of the other spots on the slate. But the likeliest outcome is still not these games shooting out, not these teams taking off. I think that the likeliest spots for the shootout, sort of my tier 4 games, when I went through this in the journal, were Baltimore and the Vikings, because Baltimore can just always find a way to put up points. And then if they're finding a way to put up points, either they're winning sort of in this, well, we'll get to this in a moment, but winning in like a pull-away fashion where the Vikings are scoring 20, but the Ravens are scoring 31, 34, whatever, or the Vikings respond and this becomes a higher scoring game. And then, of course, Bears and Giants as one of these games where we could see the scoring accelerate throughout the game, but we've already also discussed the paths to the downside. Now, the one spot that is tier 5 for me is just the Lions offense at the Commanders. This is the clearest smash ceiling, albeit with questions of where we actually go here, right? And so the Lions, we have this tremendous offense. They are coming off of a really tough physical loss to the Vikings. They are going on the road to play the team that knocked them out of the playoffs last year. This team is down their starting quarterback, and they are reeling on defense. Players just running free against their secondary. Well, we talked heading into that game against the Bears earlier this season about how the Lions are the type of team that if they get their foot on the opponent's throat, they like to keep that foot pressing down, right? This is the type of team that every once in a while, they will just go all out and try to put up as many points as they can. And we talked about that all week leading into the game against the Bears. And what did we get that week? We had them putting up 52 points. We had Jared Goff putting up 37 DraftKings points. We had Jared Goff plus Amon-Ra St. Brown plus Jameson Williams being like the easiest way to win that slate. Throw Laporta in there for some extra points or Gibbs in there for some extra points. And it was a game that wasn't competitive, and the Lions just continued to pour on the points. Well, knowing what we know about the Lions and trying to isolate and highlight the spots where we could get a game like that, this is very clearly one of the spots where we could get a game like that. Again, coming off that loss to the Vikings, going to play this Commanders team. And so that one against the Bears earlier this year was about, in my mind, it was about sending a message to an up-and-coming division opponent, to a coach in Ben Johnson who was with your team the year before, sending a message to say, this is the standard, right? This is what you're competing against. This is the hill you're trying to climb, is to try to beat us, right? We are the kings of this division, and this is what you're up against. Well, here you have a Washington team that's kind of their season's circling the drain. They're probably not making the playoffs this season at this point. And so you're not really sending a message to Washington, but you are going out there against a team that knocked you out of the playoffs last year. And coming off of a loss, you're kind of sending a message to the NFC and the NFL as a whole and saying, look, we're still here. We're still the Lions. Yeah, we had a bad game. The Vikings had a great game plan of how to exploit some weaknesses that we didn't realize we had, but we are still the Lions. You still have to come and beat us this year. Let's go out there and put up a bunch of points against the Commanders. So I will be surprised if the Lions don't go over 30 points in this spot. And then the question just becomes, where do the points shake out? Is it a game where it's coming on the ground? Is it a game where Goff's throwing 4 or 5 touchdown passes? Or is it a game where it's getting split up enough that none of these players are really winning tournaments? Some of them are posting solid scores. But I do think that this is the spot that we can think about in terms of like at least where we have the highest probability of points for a team piling up. So putting it all together, to me, it looks like a wide open week. And it looks like a week with lots of different ways that we can go. It won't be surprising to me if it's a relatively lower scoring week. Because again, if people are stacking up Rams and 49ers and that game is scoring both teams in the mid-20s, people are stacking up Bucks and Patriots and that game is scoring both teams in the mid-20s. People are stacking up Bears and Giants and that game doesn't shoot out, but it's both teams in the mid-20s, or even like a 23-17 game, or it shoots out, but there's no clear way to stack it. And so you're getting Caleb Williams plus kind of a guy who's disappointing, or Jackson Dart plus a guy who's kind of disappointing, and that lowers kind of that the math that people are turning in their favor with that setup. If the week kind of shakes out like, and Ravens and Vikings, right? If the Ravens put up 27 instead of 31, if the Ravens put up 3 touchdowns and a couple field goals and win this game 27-20, or score in that range, 27-24, then all of a sudden we've got this slate where nothing's really popping from the game environments, right? Maybe the Lions put up the big game, but no individual piece putting up the big game. And then CMC's putting up 25. And Puka's putting up 24, 26. And JSN's putting up 25, 27. And none of these mid-priced running backs are popping for huge games. It's like all of a sudden we have a slate that looks good on paper, and yet because of just the nature and structure of the slate, it could end up with 175 points shipping smaller field tournaments, 185 points, 190 points shipping large field tournaments. So it won't be surprising if it's a relatively lower scoring week, and it won't be surprising if the spikes come from game environment. So in other words, maybe these high-priced individual pieces don't post big games. Maybe the isolated one-offs that people are gravitating towards, Zay Flowers and whoever else, Devon Achane aren't posting big games, but there's a game environment that takes off. So whether that's Goff triple stacks and Goff throws 4 or 5 touchdown passes, or the Ravens and Vikings do take off in that big way, and that ends up being the game to go to. Like, I think that's where we could end up seeing the spikes for rosters coming from. So along that pathway, here are some of the angles that I'm playing around with this week in terms of where we might be able to find edge on this particular slate. 2 high-priced wide receivers. So I've talked about that. I've also talked about the reasons why it might not work out, but I do think it's something to be thinking about. So I don't necessarily on tighter builds want to get down to, and I might do it on one roster, 5% of my bankroll or something like that, but I don't necessarily want to get down to the Aaron Jones, the Kenneth Walkers, the David Montgomerys, to try to fit in the 2 high-priced wideouts. Again, I might do it, 5%, 8% of my bankroll, but that's not going to be a core staple approach for me. But I have built some DeAndre Swift plus Rico Dowdle rosters that I like and have been able to fit in 2 of these high-priced wideouts, right? So I think that is something to think about on this particular week. I think we could cross our fingers and hope on the Pats and Bucks, or cross our fingers and hope on the Rams and 49ers. There's a reason why people are going to paint the picture of those games taking off. There's a reason why people are going to isolate those games when talking about stacks and say, here's one of the stacks that could end up topping the slate. It's because it could, right? It's low probability. It's lower probability than people will want it to be, or than the discussion around these games is likely to imply, but it is still within the range of outcomes. So you can stack up those games and cross your fingers. Maybe the Giants and Bears, right? Again, who do you stack these guys with? And there's room to the downside, but there's also room to the upside in this game with 2 chaotic quarterbacks, and that chaos could lead to one of these high-scoring games. We're coming off of the Bengals-Bears game. We're coming off this stretch of the Giants allowing 30-plus points in 3 straight. So it's an easy button to push, and then we can override that by being like, I don't want to be a fish and just chase what has happened. At the same time, what has happened, right? And it does indicate to us that it can happen again. And so it's one of these spots where, it shouldn't surprise us at all if it's higher scoring. And out of the context of what's available on this slate, well, again, tier 4 out of 5 for me, like what's available and what are the possibilities of this game being higher scoring certainly tilt some of my attention in this direction. And then just the question of, how do you stack this one up in order to maximize things in this spot? Lions mega stacks is another one I'm playing around with. So Goff doubles, Goff triples. Again, this is my highest confidence spot for team scoring is the Lions this week. So then it's just a question of how can we capitalize? Ravens blow up is another one where, maybe they win this game 38-20, 41-20, 41-24, and the Ravens just take off in this game. And Lamar plus Mark Andrews plus Derrick Henry ends up being the clearest way to build on this slate toward ceiling, toward first place in tournaments. Another angle to think about is what if instead of it's a Ravens blow up, what if it's a Ravens-Vikings blow up, where the Ravens are doing so well on offense And I've already painted the picture of the downside here, right? Like I think if there's clear downside here for the Vikings defense to throw enough at the Ravens that they score 3 touchdowns and kick a couple field goals, and we have this 27-24 type game, 27-23, whatever it might be. That's certainly within the range of outcomes here. But also within the range of outcomes is the Ravens do really well in this spot. I think that that's as likely as the Ravens getting held down in this spot, right? Again, our story of the Ravens getting held down is them scoring 27 points. It's hard to see them finishing below that. And so then it's not far for them to get up to 30 plus, 4 touchdowns, maybe even an outside shot at 5 touchdowns in the spot. And then the question becomes, what if that means that the Vikings say, all right, we're trying to not put too much on JJ McCarthy's plate, but we're also 4-4. We're still alive in this really tough NFC. We've got to win this game, right? Like, and we're trailing by 10 points or whatever it is, and they're shutting down the run. Let's turn the ball over to JJ McCarthy. Let's let him throw the ball 33, 35 times. And then he's got Justin Jefferson. He's got Jordan Addison. So there is a story to tell here of not just a Ravens blow up, but a Ravens Vikings blow up, where you're playing Lamar, Mark Andrews, Derrick Henry, Justin Jefferson, maybe even Jordan Addison, or one of those 2 guys, one or the other of those 2 guys together. Maybe even JJ McCarthy with 2 of his wide receivers and with a bring back or 2 from the Ravens side. So I think that that's a story to play around with this week as well. And then one other angle to think about that I don't think I'm going to build this one on my tighter builds this week, but I did want to highlight it, and that's a Bills blow up. And that's basically saying, yeah, the Bills don't typically put the Josh Allen Superman cape on unless it's a competitive game environment. And yeah, we don't expect the Dolphins to push the Bills in this spot. And this game is in Miami, like all these factors. And yet, I mean, would it surprise us if Sunday ends and we look at the box scores and it's like the Bills won 41-10? That shouldn't surprise us, right? And so that's another angle to play around with and how we might want to build around that this week. Kind of funny, actually. I always finish this podcast with a bottom-up build. I didn't prepare a bottom-up build today. I'm just now realizing that. So there goes me coming in here talking about maybe we're done with the Angles podcast. Moving forward, not even building a bottom-up build today, but I'm going to build it in real time. And I'm going to start out with Rico Dowdle and DeAndre Swift. If you're new here, bottom-up build, we build with a $44K salary cap. We also have a contest with a $44K salary cap. It's free to enter. Obviously, the DraftKings salary cap doesn't change, so you got to follow the rules. In order to win, you have to build with a salary cap of less than $44K. It is free to enter. It's $100 to first place. You can find the link at the top of my player grid outside the paywall, which is on the scroll on OWS. You can also find it in the Discord in the BUB channel and participate in the bottom-up build with us. Build a $44K. This week's winner scored 205 points. Low in salary. I wish I had pulled up the winner's name so that I could shout him out, but 205 points. My best roster last week. I finished 6th in the face mask with 203 points. So that's one of the things I love about the bottom-up build is we can get these super high-scoring games without spending all of our salary. So actually, I'm going to find this who it was that did this and find their roster. So we're kind of all over the place here, but bear with me for just a moment. Okay, the winner was Dev Horn. And the roster was Caleb Williams with Kyle Monungai. And I kept looking at that last week and being like, you know, if I'm going to play Caleb Williams, I don't feel confident stacking him with anybody. Maybe you just go Caleb Williams plus Kyle Monungai. So really sharp way to go there. Brock Bowers, obviously a big piece for us last week toward tournament wins or those high tournament finishes, and ended up with T. Higgins on this roster, which is awesome because we know that in these bottom-up build contests, people are often looking for ways to get up to that high-priced player in order to try to get these 200-point scores spending only $44K in salary. So probably some Jamar Chase ownership last week. Get the leverage off that with T. Higgins, with the bring back to the Caleb Williams and Kyle Monungai. And that's obviously a big part of how this roster is winning, is starting out with Caleb Williams, Kyle Monungai, T. Higgins, and Brock Bowers. Rounded it out with Jalen Warren, Parker Washington, Chris Olave, Travion Henderson, and the Giants defense special teams. Again, spending $43.8K in salary, scoring over 205 points. Just really cool to see that. And yeah, though that's what we're doing here, right? Is trying to think how we can build for upside. And then just as a great thought exercise for us to stretch our brains and see how we can save salary, build a strong roster with only $44K in salary spent. Did you score 205.2 last week, spending $50K in salary? Most of us probably didn't. So just really cool to see that from a 44K, 43.8K salary cap roster. And then it kind of allows you to take that roster and say, okay, like salary's not as tight as I was thinking this week. What can I do from here in order to build a really strong roster with 50K in salary? So I am building out this roster as we talk. I'm going to put Rico Dowdle and DeAndre Swift in at running back. We've got a couple quarterback pairings where you look at Lamar Jackson on a roster like this, and you're like, I can't spend that much in salary. He's 6.8K, but his clear stacking partner is Mark Andrews, which turns it into a 10.2K stack. Who's the cheapest viable quarterback this week? It's Jacoby Brissett. He's 4.6K, but his clear stacking partner is Trey McBride, and that's 10.6K. So it actually costs more than Lamar Jackson plus Mark Andrews. I've got the Browns defense on here to save some salary, going against the Jets competitive advantage. We don't know who the quarterback is, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes of targeting upside. Jalen Coker, we had Tedero McMillan pop up with a hamstring injury on Friday, may or may not end up playing this week. So Jalen Coker, 3,300 would have been a viable way to save salary on this slate or on this bottom-up build roster anyway, on this slate anyway, but now we get the Tedero McMillan news and makes him at 3.3K that much more powerful. We're going to throw Cade Otton in here. Won't spend much time talking about him, but he will show up in the player grid, and I'll talk through things there. And now at this point, we have 11.3K left to spend with Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, Rico Dowdle, DeAndre Swift, Cade Otton, Browns defense, and then Jalen Coker as a salary saver. And it actually has given us a roster that we kind of like at this point. So I'm going to throw in Jalen Waddle because he's one of my higher confidence plays, and I feel pretty confident that we will have the salary to do that with something else that we don't hate. We get Jameson Williams down here at 4,900. He's a borderline light blue chip play for me this week. Jalen Waddle, I don't recall if I have him in the light blue section or in wide receiver 1 section, but he's a player I really like this week. So actually a roster I like a ton this week where I'm going to read through this. We've got 6K in salary left over. Lamar Jackson, my favorite quarterback play, just isolated on the week. And the clearest way to stack is with Mark Andrews. So we get that cheaper price tag on that stack. Rico Dowdle plus DeAndre Swift. I built a lot of practice builds and have these two running backs on them this week. Jalen Waddle, one of my favorite wideouts. Jameson Williams, one of my favorite wideouts. Cade Otton, one of my favorite salary savers. The Browns defense, one of my favorite defenses this week. And then the only place where we have somebody who's not just like pretty high up on my list of plays to play this week is Jalen Coker at 3,300, and he's still one of the stronger ways to save salary this week, especially if Tedero McMillan is out. So that gives us a final roster of Lamar Jackson, Rico Dowdle, DeAndre Swift, Jalen Coker, Jalen Waddle, Jameson Williams, Mark Andrews, Cade Otton, and the Browns defense special teams spending exactly 44K in salary, built live on this podcast, spending exactly 44K in salary, 6K in salary left over. Getting the bottom up build contest. Again, it's free to enter. It's $100 to first place, and a really cool way to stretch your mind, compete against the OWS fam, and see what type of score you can put up with 44K in salary spent. So with that, actually kind of a fun podcast. It was about the last like 5 or 10 minutes where I was like, well, I do really enjoy doing this podcast. And even if nobody's watching, maybe we'll keep it up the rest of the season. It's a lot with the Pete show ending and then immediately hop onto this and immediately hop on to Solo Ship, especially if we're just talking about the same things. And a lot of you have realized we're talking about the same things. So you've moved on from this podcast. You're listening to other stuff, reading other stuff. But yeah, fun to do this one today. And as always, enjoy sitting down, hanging out with you, chatting. If you're in Inner Circle, as always, you'll have another solo podcast Saturday evening. It's actually going to be Saturday morning this week because Abby and I are going to a concert Saturday night this week. We don't normally have plans on Saturday night because of my work schedule, but apparently she planned this a couple months ago, and I said that's fine, and I didn't remember that. But so I'll be doing my Inner Circle podcast in the morning this week. And so if you're in Inner Circle, you will find that on the Inner Circle podcast feed on Saturday afternoon. More solo pod thoughts on where my thoughts are at as I head into building. And with that, I'm going to get out of here. I will see you on 1 week season throughout the weekend. Thanks for hanging out with me here on YouTube, especially if you're not a subscriber. Really appreciate you guys swinging by to hang out with us, kind of pick our brains and see what we're thinking, what we're seeing. So I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.